Sandman is one of the first comic series I ever collected. I bought the trade paperbacks in the late 90s, early 2000s, and I've read them many times since. It's still one of my favourite comic series of all time, but now they've turned it into a TV series on Netflix. How can it possibly compare to the comics? Well, let's find out. Episode 1, Sleep of the Just, is basically the same story as issue 1. Only where the issue begins and ends with the Burgess family, the show begins and ends with Morpheus in the dreaming, because he is, after all, the main character. The book is much more of a horror story than the show, with Burgess summoning this mysterious demon. We don't know who or what it is, and the horrible revenge it takes on his family when it's let out. This is actually much worse in the book, as Burgess' son is condemned to an eternal nightmare of waking over and over again. In the show he just gets eternal sleep, which is nowhere near as scary. But if you don't know any better, it's a perfectly effective opening instalment. Episode 2, Imperfect Hosts, is basically the same as issue 2, only instead of starting with Cain and Abel and moving on to Lucian, the show starts with Lucian and moves on to Cain and Abel. The main casting difference is that in the show Lucian is a bald black woman, which is actually a good idea, because in the book he looks far too similar to Cain, and it's always easy to confuse those two characters. In the show you have no such problem. The pacing does start to become a bit of a problem with this episode. Nothing much happens except for the encounter with the Fates, which, to be fair, is every bit as effective as it is in the book. You do start to get the feeling that stretching out one issue to fit an episode might not work in the long term. So episode 3 goes some ways to fixing this. It's mainly issue 3 of the comic, but it does have a long opening sequence to give you some of the flavour of Constantine's usual adventures. And it's a lot of fun. Also, Constantine's a woman now. This is somewhat of a controversial change. If you've never seen John Constantine before, then a faithful adaptation would have been a good way to introduce him. But I've read quite a few issues of Hellblazer and seen every episode of Legends of Tomorrow. So personally, I welcome a new take on the character. And Joanna Constantine is great. She's not just a gender-swapped John Constantine. She doesn't chain smoke, and she doesn't look like she's been dragged through hedge backwards at all times. But she still has a lot of the essential darkness of the character. And Jenna Coleman gives an extremely charismatic performance. I certainly wouldn't complain if they decided to insert the character into future episodes. Again, a lot of the horror elements of the issue are turned down somewhat in the episode. But apart from that, it's still a very good watch, and definitely the best episode so far. Episode 4 is almost exactly the same as issue 4. The main difference is that instead of endless voiceover by Dream, the show introduces Matthew the Raven to give him someone to talk to. I can see why they did that. It would have been a pretty gloomy episode otherwise. But Patton Oswalt's voice is a bit of an acquired taste, and you do get rather a lot of it here. Etrigan the Demon is also missing, which is a bit of a shame. But I guess he comes under the category of Disney characters they can't use. Gwendolyn Christie appears as Lucifer, which is ridiculous casting. I mean, how could a woman possibly look like... Oh yeah, actually she looks pretty similar. Yeah, it's good casting. Good for them. In fact, she's a lot closer than Chronozon, who only has one mouth, rather than the two he has in the comic. Which looks a bit cheap, just me. But Chronozon is soon banished to the background, as it's Lucifer who plays the oldest game with Morpheus. And rather than just sitting there talking to each other, the game's a lot more dynamic. You see Morpheus actually suffering from the injuries that get inflicted on him, which certainly helps it look better on screen. On the whole, it's definitely the most faithful episode yet. Episode 4 also includes scenes from issue 5, which the series otherwise skips. To be fair, it is mainly Morpheus visiting the dreams of all the DC heroes, which the show doesn't have the rights to. But the subplot of John Dee breaking out of the asylum, not Arkham, remains intact, and we still get to see him being given a lift by Rosemary. Although whereas in the book he ends up killing her, in the show he sets her free. He is generally a much more sympathetic character in the show, rather than the bizarre, cartoonish, ghoul-like creature he is in the comics. And this more three-dimensional portrayal of his continues through to 24 Hours, Episode 5, which adapts Issue 6. In the book the story is mainly told through narration, but in the show they get rid of all that, and have the characters talking to each other a lot more. This does help to develop the characters more before all the horrific things start happening to them, but it does take away from the surreal atmosphere of the comic. There was a fan film version of this episode made in 2017, which was extremely faithful to the comic. Although the acting in that one was pretty terrible, the atmosphere was a lot better, and it was considerably more scary. In the show version, you certainly don't get the sense that 24 hours are passing, or anything that's happening in the outside world. And the horror elements are certainly not dwelt on as they are in the comics. But people who haven't read the comics say it's one of the best issues of the series. So what do I know? Then we get Morpheus' confrontation with John Dee. In the book this takes up an entire issue, but in the show it's just a few minutes at the end of the episode. Which is a shame, as they'd been building John Dee up throughout the entire half season. And to have his defeat come this easily just feels a bit of an anticlimax. Although we do still get this iconic image from the comic, which certainly ends the episode on a high note. Episode 6 starts by adapting issue 8, which is one of the best issues of the comic and one of my favourites. And apart from a few minor differences, it's incredibly faithful. The main difference is that Death does not look like a teenage girl as she does in the comic. She's played by Kirby Howell-Baptiste, who is in her mid-30s. I should stress that for anyone who hasn't read the comics, this is not a problem. She's a great actress. Her performance is excellent and she'll probably win a lot of awards. But she's not the same version of Death that's been in my head for decades. It's just such an iconic look. The character's never been adapted before, so they should have at least tried to get an actress who matched the image in the book. They certainly did a good job with Dream. Tom Sturridge is excellent and looks just like the character in the books. I should point out this is not about race. I'd feel the same way if they'd made her blonde or redhead. If anything, her age is more of a problem. The whole point of the character is she's the oldest being in the universe, but still looks and sometimes acts like a teenager. I guess finding a new actress who could pull off that kind of duality would be a tough ask. And I can see that if they cast somebody who looked just like that, but couldn't act, the episode would have been terrible. I do get that, but still, I don't know which version of Death I'd rather see when it's my time. I'll just have to make sure that doesn't happen for a very long time, if at all. Which brings me to the second half of the episode, which adapts to Men of Good Fortune from a few issues later. And it does it very well, I can't really fault it. The only significant change is that Death shows up 30 years late for the final meeting, but if anything that's an improvement on the original. All in all, episode 6 is definitely the best of the series, faithfully adapting two of the best issues of the comic. Despite my little rant earlier, it's definitely the high point of the series. Episode 7 starts with The Dollhouse Part 1, and here we meet Desire and Despair, whose castings I have no problem with. Desire is played by a non-binary person, which is just what the character should be. And Despair isn't naked in the show, but in this issue you can't really tell that she is anyway, so it doesn't really matter. Then we meet Rose Walker. She's played by a black actress in the show. She's still a young woman with multicoloured hair. That's really all you need for the character. The main change is that her mother has been killed off and replaced with Lita Hall. This is actually quite clever, as Lita and her husband were existing DC characters who showed up in Sandman with very little explanation, and DC have never repented their pre-Sandman appearances, leaving generations of readers extremely confused. Tying Rose to Lita makes a lot of sense, as now they can be together in the future issues where she becomes a lot more important. The rest of the episode adapts part 2 of the story, and we get to meet Lita's weird housemates, who are all very much as they are in the comics. Episode 8 gives a kind of remixed version of part 3. The Nightmares Brute and Glob don't appear in the show. They've been replaced by a new character called Gaunt, which is probably a good thing, as they do look a bit too cartoony for the show. Also in this episode we get to see Rose having actual conversation with Morpheus, which doesn't happen until the end of the book. Whereas in the book she doesn't really know what's going on and just drifts through it until the very end. So I guess that's an improvement for her character. Dream's confrontation with Lita from this same issue happens in episode 9, and it sets up future events nicely. So hopefully we get to see the ramifications of that in future series. Also in episode 9 is what was part 5 of the story, the Serial Convention. And it's a very faithful adaptation. Some of the characters look exactly like their comic equivalents. The main difference is at the end, where Funland goes after Jet instead of Rose. And he's killed. Whereas in the comic he's given sweet dreams, which always seemed like letting him off too easy. Episode 10, and we're still in the convention. The Corinthian has a lot more scenes in the show than he does in the books, building him up as the big bad to be dealt with in the final episode. But Sandman isn't really that kind of good versus evil story, so when Morpheus finally catches up to him, he's dealt with just as easily as he did in the books. So the rest of episode 10 still has 2 issues to get through. There's a whole issue of Rose going through her housemate's dreams, which in the show is dealt with in just a few minutes. And then part 7. Rose confronts Morpheus. In the book, this is their first real conversation, whereas in the show they've been chatting for a few episodes. But it all ends in much the same way, with Unity becoming the Vortex and Rose going back to her life. Only this time it's with Lita and her baby. But wait, there's more. The bonus episode starts with adapting Dream of a Thousand Cats. It's pretty much the exact same story as the comic. Although instead of live action, it's done with CGI. But it's a triumph of animation, and it certainly bodes well for some of the future issues, which you would think were unfilmable. Finally, we get Clippy, which again is very close to the original. Clippy is not blonde in the show. She is played by an actual Greek woman, which makes a lot more sense. Also, she's not naked. In the book, you can tell at a glance what's been done to her, and later on you do see her being raped. But in the show, she's fully clothed in all her scenes, and never appears even slightly dishevelled. I can see why they did this. A faithful adaptation would have been an incredibly good watch, but it does minimise the horror of what's happening to the character. Surely they could have made it a bit more explicit without going too far. Still, the final scene between Morpheus and Clippy works very well in the show. You do get the feeling that they've had a long and complex relationship, and if they'd cast a teenage girl as Clippy to be faithful to the book, it wouldn't have worked nearly as well. But overall, it's a lot better than some recent adaptations like Lock and Key or Wheel of Time. Episode 6 is probably the high point, but many of the episodes are extremely faithful adaptations, and the changes they make are improvements for the most part. The comic is still my preferred version, but if I watch the TV show first, I may well have preferred that. Here's hoping it gets several more seasons to complete the story. Thanks for watching. Next week I might be talking about the first episode of House of the Dragon. Or I might wait until the series finale to talk about that, so we'll see. Anyway, whatever my next video is, please subscribe if you don't want to miss it. Or press like if you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.